If one band could define the West Coast sound of the 1970s, it would have to be Fleetwood Mac. With their blockbuster album Rumours, the band had managed to become one of the biggest selling acts in the history of music. Their subsequent implosion during the 1980s left many wondering about the futures of the individual band members, and their surprise reunion for the inauguration of newly elected President Bill Clinton fueled speculation that the Fab Five might get together for one last album. But it was not to be, at least not at that time. It was yet another episode of the long soap opera that has been the history of one of the world's most popular and enduring groups. It is a story of dizzying highs and frightening lows, and a dedication to keeping the band going in spite of all its troubles.
We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s.
In 1964, the only thing that mattered to most of the world were four long-haired young men from Liverpool, England.
Here they are, the Beatles!
The Beatles changed the face of rock and roll and ushered in a dominance of the music charts by British acts that were little more than pale imitations of the Fab Four. While the Beatles cranked out hit after hit in an amazing run of music the likes of which rock and roll would never see again, bands like the Dave Clark Five and Jerry and the Pacemakers were dominating the rest of the music charts, with their saccharine sweet riffs leaving many to wonder whether rock was about to hit another stagnant wall. But once again, American music would prove to be both an inspiration and a savior to the British music scene, this time in the form of the blues.
It's quite interesting because, of course, we were talking about the blues, and that's what, I mean, the Yardbirds have always been rooted in the blues, not black musicians really living that. We were sort of doing a white version of it, and hey, we were five white guys pretty much from suburbia.
And there was all the blues groups like Chicken Shack, Savoy Brown, and Mike Vernon was producing all sort of bluesy records with British acts. So there was a lot of credit given to the blues artists at the time.
There was quite a thriving blues scene. There were all these English rhythm and blues bands, of which the Rolling Stones were one. And then, of course, later on, when I joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers, I became part of that musical scene myself.
Of the myriad groups who were playing the so-called British blues, none was more influential at this time than the Blues Breakers, led by John Mayall, and featuring a young prodigy by the name of Eric Clapton on guitar.
It's God, Clapton is God and all that. And I don't, even to this day and ever again, will you ever see that sort of adoration for a guitar player.
But Clapton soon grew restless in the Blues Breakers, leaving the door open to a young upstart guitarist who was a fan of his.
There's been two pivotal moments when I've been in Eric's company. One was our meeting with Jimi Hendrix, and the other was seeing Peter Green with his band at the Civic Hall in Guildford.
In came John Mayall, and a guitar player he simply didn't recognise. And Mike Vernon said, well, who's this? You know, I mean, where's Eric Clapton? Oh, he quit the band. Don't worry, this guy's better. And Mike Vernon said, don't be ridiculous, you know. He was, I mean, Peter Green was just magnificent. He certainly made his mark, and that, of course, led to Fleetwood Mac.
I think people forget that Fleetwood Mac are called Fleetwood Mac because they were originally called Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, and was, at the time, thought of by many people as a better guitarist than Eric Clapton.
Green's vision of the perfect British blues band was coming to fruition. After grabbing former Blues Breaker drummer Mick Fleetwood, who had been let go by John Mayall for rowdy behavior, Green quickly christened his new band after his favorite rhythm section, Fleetwood Mac. But the other half of this favorite rhythm section, bass player John McVie, was more than happy to remain with Mayall and his strict rules. While McVie played it safe, Peter enlisted the help of Bob Brunning to play for the band that bore the name of another bass player.
He liked that rhythm section immensely, and let's face it, it's still there, you know. I'm not surprised. Peter actually wanted right from the outset John McVie, but John McVie had a nice, safe job, you know, good, steady income. You know, you knew where you were, you got your weekly wages and no messing around.
Bob was under no illusions about his status in this new band, however.
But it was made quite clear that I was on board until John decided. And I didn't mind that. You join a band of that caliber, you just see it as a break, you know.
Green also recruited a young guitar player named Jeremy Spencer as a counterpoint to himself, in more ways than one.
Jeremy was there, who was this umpy little bloke, you know, who didn't really want to speak to anybody. He was always, you know, a bit off with people, one might say.
Jeremy Spencer was like an act within an act. He didn't interact with them musically in a sense. He did his, you know, in his silly rock and roll parodies and lots of fun, lots of entertainment.
Jeremy must have been the first copy band all on his own. He took Elmore James and copied it. You know how many copy bands you've got in the world now? You know, from the Japanese Beatles to, like, you know, the other Rolling Stones to you name it, to the Abbas and whatever you like, right? Jeremy was the first one-man band, copy band.
The early days of Fleetwood Mac were about saying we need a variety of sounds here. And just as the Rolling Stones had to have Brian Jones and they had to have Bill Wyman, they had to have Jeremy Spencer because he was the counterpoint to the rather slower, lugubrious, moody Peter Green work.
The band, now firmly in place, began rehearsing for their debut live performance.
I said, well, what's the first gig, you know? And I thought it'd be a club somewhere, and oh no, it's the Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival.
The festival was set to be a gathering of some of the premier blues acts on the British Isles, including the Blues Breakers, with John McVie still on bass. But for Bob Brunning, there was one bigger concern than whether or not the band bore another bassist's name.
We were very frightened because when we started rehearsing a bit and I was Green, you know, of course, I must tell you the other thing that Peter Green said during this audition was, you know, I'm very influenced by B.B. King. And I said, well, who's B.B. King? And he actually fainted, you know. And he gave me an armful of records and said, go home, do your homework, you know, which I did. But I'll tell you, you've never seen a bunch of more scared guys on the way to that gig.
The band made quite an impression at the festival, though many say this was due in no small part to the talent of the band's leader.
And the rest of us were just there, plonking away and doing all right, but, you know, he was already showing his immense skill. And his beautiful voice, I mean, he had this double skill. Not only was a terrific guitar player, but he had a fabulous voice.
There was another performer on the bill that day that made quite an impression, on Fleetwood Mac.
Christine Perfect then, of course, married John McVie and became Christine McVie. I feel sometimes she's been almost understated, her voice. I mean, she's got a glorious voice and made a massive contribution to the band. She wasn't just the sort of girl singer, you know, she had her writing, of course, you know.
And I thought Christine was one of the best singers I'd ever sort of come across. When she recorded I'd Rather Go Blind, which was their big hit, and I thought, you know, Christine is going to be sort of fantastic. I'm so pleased to be sort of part and looking after Chicken Shack with her in it. And then up turns John McVie, so she leaves and gets married for him and joins Fleetwood Mac.
It would be some time, however, before Christine would join the lineup of the band, but there would be an addition to the front lineup. Green recruited 18-year-old Danny Kerwin to fill the third guitar spot in his dream blues band.
Danny Kerwin I never saw live, but on record, I thought he was a curious person to have in the group, and my friends and I who liked Fleetwood Mac for a while thought they'd slightly gone down the pan when he joined, I must say, because we weren't quite sure what his role was in the band. I think what we might be seeing there, though, is Peter Green being less and less happy with the role of band leader as he went on. I think he was not the most prolific of songwriters, and bringing in another songwriter, and particularly, you know, an attractive blonde-haired guy who might get his face plastered across the newspapers, was probably quite a good career move from that sort of pop sensibility.
But all was not well within the band, or within its founding father. Peter Green was undergoing a change, spurred on by an incident in Germany, one that would have dramatic effects on not only his music and his bandmates, but his life.
At that particular time, bizarrely and rather horrendously, it was a kind of tradition, I think, that if you liked somebody and respected their music, then one of the nicest things you could do was to give them a big mound of dangerous Category A drugs. And he was touring, I think they were in Germany, and a load of people who were in the audience invited him back to their place. And they were absolutely this sort of messianic figure, Peter Green, you know, in our house, you know. And they had a lot of very strong acid and offered him this stuff and suggested he took loads of it, because that was clearly their way of, it wasn't malice, this was some kind of affection for the man. And he took all this acid and it suffered an appalling kind of mental implosion.
Peter deteriorated quickly. He began to take on a Christ-like appearance and would enhance it with long flowing robes and an occasional large crucifix. While their leader lost his grip on reality, the other band members struggled to maintain the success that the group had worked so hard to attain. But for Peter, the die was cast. It would ultimately destroy his career.
What is interesting about Peter Green, and it's sad in a way, was the fact that actually Peter Green lost his marbles along the way, which is very sad.
Peter began displaying disturbing behaviour for his friends, and it was quite obvious that something wasn't quite right. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic.
Green's demise was quick. Within a very short span of time, he could no longer function as a person, much less the leader of Fleetwood Mac. By the end of 1970, he had left the group behind. And he had left a vacuum within the world of the blues that was now almost entirely dominated by one Mr. Eric Clapton.
Peter was under a lot of pressure, self-imposed maybe, and just found the whole thing too much and eventually turned in on himself and disappeared, as you say, for 25 years nearly.
I think if Peter Green had, kept his marbles and had honed that skill that he had naturally, that sweetness of guitar playing. I mean, his voice was an incredible, incredible voice. And he had that charisma. He actually had more charisma than Eric had. And Eric had a lot of charisma. But Peter Green had a presence on stage that was quite extraordinary.
Unfortunately for the band, their two remaining frontmen were not in much better shape to take the reins of leadership.
I think it was a pretty dysfunctional organisation, Fleetwood Mac, and I think it carried on being that actually for another 20 years. I think once you joined Fleetwood Mac, you left sanity behind you as you shut the door and entered that world. It was like checking into the Hotel California in a real sense. And I think that if you were in a band that was still really known as Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac and suddenly Peter isn't there, wow, what do you do? For Danny Kirwan to stand up and sing Man of the World, it's a very difficult thing to do.
It would prove too difficult. Though the addition of the new Mrs. Christine McVie and guitarist Bob Welch would alleviate some of the stress on Danny Kirwan and Jeremy Spencer, Danny began to deteriorate almost as quickly as his mentor had done before him. He took to drinking too much and eventually wound up smashing his guitar before a live show, leaving the band to play without him on stage. It was the last straw.
It just got out of hand for Danny, I think. That was his problem. His behaviour became intolerable. No doubt the final story where he also had a bit of a drug problem too, where he refused to play and smashed things up and finally went out to the mixing desk and, very sad. The man was ill, but they couldn't. I mean, they had a show to do, and you can't carry someone who is getting to the point where they simply cannot play and simply cannot do the job they're paid for. So they had to say bye-bye to Danny, and I'm afraid he's never really recovered. I mean, he lives in London, but he's never made a complete recovery, sadly.
Once again, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie showed their strength in managing to keep the band together despite any setbacks.
Lesser men would have said, right, that's it, I've had enough. Because at that stage, they were such well-known musicians. I'm sure John could have walked off and joined, pretty much any band, and so could Mick. But they wanted to hang on in there, as they're still doing all these years later.
This incarnation of the band was to have little impact on the music scene, but guitarist Jeremy Spencer was about to make a very dramatic exit. During a tour of America, Spencer left his hotel room in Los Angeles and promptly disappeared. For 3 days, the band had no idea where he was, until he was located at a building occupied by a religious sect known as the Children of God. They found Jeremy, now calling himself Joshua, surrounded by the cult members who massaged his arms and chanted as he was confronted by his bandmates.
I mean, it must have been extremely worrying, apart from anything else, to suddenly, he's gone, he's disappeared. So I think the band were initially confused, worried, and so on. He'd made his decision and they couldn't move him, and they wished him well, and that's what he's been doing for the last 30 plus years. It wasn't obviously a frivolous decision. It was something very important for him.
Oddly enough, it was an old friend who came to the rescue of the band.
What Mick did was immediately phone up Peter Green, who left the band for some time, and said, help, 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 we're in the middle of a tour and we're desperate, please could you help us? And Peter, being the generous man that he was, although he was, I'm quite sure, quite beginning to be getting quite ill by then, went out and sort of saved the day. But it was a huge shock for the band.
It was time for yet a new incarnation of Fleetwood Mac, but it would only be an intermission in a play that had yet to feature two of its strongest characters.
The Bob Welch era has been entirely airbrushed, and I think that's because at that time they didn't really sell very many records, and he was a bridge in that he could play some of the old Fleetwood Mac songs, but he was a writer himself. He was a catalyst in turning them into the California band that they became. If you compile a list of the great Fleetwood Mac records of their era, I don't think any of the ones they did with Bob would make it into the top 100.
Quite a few people have been through the band, but they all had their role to play, and a good one too. When they discovered Lindsay and Stevie, they hit the jackpot.
Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham were no strangers to the music scene when Mick Fleetwood found them in Los Angeles in the early 70s. They had played in a band called Fritz in the late 60s and had supported some of the biggest names of the era. They had suffered the internal tensions that bands inevitably go through and had split from Fritz to make a go of it alone in Los Angeles. They had found in each other not only a musical voice, but a love relationship that would drive the two of them to create some of their best music. And they had released an album of those songs only to see it sink out of sight with nothing to show for it but a provocative album cover and a following in Birmingham, Alabama. Stevie was working as a waitress while leaving Lindsay the time to hone his skills, but fate was about to deal them a significantly better hand.
It's a great story how Mick happened to be in the studio and happened to be hearing their record being made and thinking, I wonder if they'd like to join my band.
They were looking for a studio. Mick wanted to hear what the studio sounded like, and he pushed a button and out came the voice of Stevie Nicks. And he said, wow, never mind the studio, give me her phone number. He only wanted Stevie Nicks, he didn't want Lindsay Buckingham. But Stevie said, uh-oh, no, both of us or none of us. The rest is history.
It's impossible to imagine something like that happening now, and also just how desperate were Lindsay and Stevie that they accepted the offer from this, as it were, has-been English blues band who not many people had heard of. And there must have been some kind of magic in there, and I guess you can hear that on the record. The first Fleetwood Mac California-style record that's called simply Fleetwood Mac is a wonderful, wonderful record, I think. And my guess is that it slightly took them by surprise as well.
Fleetwood Mac was about to become something very different from the British blues band that was its roots.
They went from Fleetwood Mac Blues Band to Fleetwood Mac Rock and Roll Band, with, you know, Fleetwood Mac Blues Band selling 300,000 records to Fleetwood Mac Rock and Roll Band selling 4 million records on their first outing. The whole sound that these 5 people produced, that really catapulted them, particularly with Mick and John driving it all the way.
The first musical venture for the new group was simply titled Fleetwood Mac. It was an album that would change forever how the group was viewed and would put Stevie Nicks over the top in terms of who the fans identified with.
She does what she does, but underneath it all is a very calculating individual who was going to be a huge star. She had got the leverage that she wanted by joining Fleetwood Mac. And, you know, I've always recall her saying in a performance that she had worked it all out, and it's put her on top of her profession.
With her heart-wrenching songs, smoky saloon delivery, and mystical stage presence, Stevie Nicks had gone from a faceless Hollywood waitress to the most recognizable member of a band who was about to capture the imagination of the world.
She wasn't your standard lead singer from a group, even though there wasn't that many. I mean, if you take her and Debbie Harry, for instance, she was completely different to Debbie Harry. Debbie Harry was very much pushing her sexuality. I don't think Stevie was as much. She put her music forward, and her music was the one that made the statement. I think people connected with the music.
And while Stevie Nicks had become the very public face of Fleetwood Mac, her lover had succeeded in becoming the sound of the band.
I think he had that fantastic production sensibility, which was completely right for that era. I think some of those records have begun to sound a bit dated now, not all of them, some of them have, but at the time that crisp, compact disc, as we would have called it then, sound was absolutely the sound of the time, and it was perfect for FM radio, which wanted that clarity and that depth that it wasn't used to from old mono singles. So yes, I'd say Lindsay's production sensibility was hugely important in their success.
It also brought out something in a longtime member of the band, who until now had not been overlooked so much as overshadowed.
When Stevie and Lindsay joined the band, I think it became quite apparent how much pop sensibility that Christina's got. And she'd started writing. I mean, she'd always been writing, but I think with the blues incarnation of Fleetwood Mac remained largely ignored. Whereas with this whole new style, this new sort of, incarnation of Fleetwood Mac, the input of Stevie and Lindsay, that obviously bore fruit for her. Her writing was now going to be very much part of this new Fleetwood Mac that, that happened in the 70s.
Well, he's, of course, a very fine producer. I think there was just a buzz going on in the band, and Christine could see there were some good songs being written, and she discovered herself she could write good songs, and there was a sort of buzz going on, and they'd bounce off each other's ideas and so on and so on.
There was some concern within the band that Christine would have trouble adjusting to another female in this, an admittedly male-dominated forum. They needn't have concerned themselves.
She had no problem with it at all. And they became very good friends. But no, she's on records saying it's like having a sister on the road, another woman, thank God, instead of all these smelly blokes, I don't think there was any kind of real rivalry. I think they recognised each other's skills.
With the success of their first outing, the group embarked on their first tour together. It was a resounding success, with Stevie and Lindsay taking center stage as the group's new focal point. Audiences loved the smoldering sexuality of the young couple and embraced them as newfound rock royalty. The world was now theirs for the taking, and the group began recording their next album. Little did they know that the album would be more than just a record. It would be their masterpiece. It would also serve as a window into their private struggles, not the least of which was the disintegration of their personal relationships. Troubled times were ahead, and Fleetwood Mac was about to play them out in front of millions of devoted fans.
Rumours is the great soap opera of rock and roll, and just like every soap opera, you almost wanted to tune in for the next episode. What would the next song tell you about them? Who wrote this? Who is singing this? Who's singing this about whom?
The album started out like any other, with the group getting together and working on the individual tracks. But unlike the recording of the White Album only a little while before, the band was not a unified entity. The strains of recording, touring, and maintaining Fleetwood Mac had taken its toll on the individual members and had led to the disintegration of not only Stevie and Lindsay's relationship, but the marriage of John and Christine McVie. Even Mick Fleetwood was not immune. His relationship with his wife had deteriorated to the point where divorce seemed like the only answer. The material reflected the inner turmoil and would leave fans with many questions.
She's not really going out with him. Has she split up with him? Is he having an affair with her? And the answer in most cases was yes. Anything you could think of that lot doing to and with each other, they probably were.
The album played like a dialogue between band members, with each trying to get in the final word. They ranged from blistering attacks to songs of condolence. John McVie, for one, was having a terrible time of things, as his soon-to-be ex-wife Christine had developed a relationship with one of the band's road crew. He found a novel way of coping.
He was probably on his yacht before he even realised what was going to go on top of it, because he'd recorded all his bass parts. He didn't care what the songs were, you know. So he probably, whoa, what's it about when he actually got the album or something? I don't know. That's my supposition. But yes, jokes apart, it must have been difficult for them doing that.
The music is certainly the members of the band speaking to each other through the music. Maybe they couldn't actually sit down in a conversation and sit down and have a conversation with each other, so they had to talk through music. And I think most of the fans picked up on that. They knew that this couple, Stevie and Lindsay, had broken up and Mick and John had broken up, and they were talking amongst themselves. The only side effect was that poor John, who didn't write any lyrics, couldn't actually speak back.
Though the breakup of John and Christine was by far the more serious matter, considering that it involved a divorce, it was the split between Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham that dominated the thoughts of fans around the world. The feuding couple became the focus of the imaginations of millions, but in private their problems changed the dynamic within Fleetwood Mac.
I think it may have defined them a little bit, actually. I think with the breakup between them, it defined Lindsay more of a person who can do something on his own. And I think it certainly defined Stevie. Stevie obviously went on with her solo career. She became detached from the band and she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. Maybe if Rumours hadn't happened the way it did, she may not have been able to do that.
When released, the album took off almost immediately. Spawning hit single after hit single, the album stayed on the charts and kept the band's private lives in the spotlight. The group launched a tour to support the album, but both the music and the spectacle had already gripped the fans.
Find me a house without a copy of Rumours in. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration. But no, because it's timeless. I can put Rumours on now, and it sounds like the Beatles had exactly the same ability. You can hear Please Please Me or Yesterday and Beatles songs 1,000 times, and they sound as fresh as ever. And I think Rumours is like that.
Many people went to see Fleetwood Mac to enjoy the music, but it seemed that just as many went to see if the fireworks from the album's recording sessions would be evident on stage. They weren't.
You could go back to Rumours and say, my God, how could they ever go on the road together again after that lot? But, you know, they're tough. All of them. We keep mentioning John McVie and Mick, but the same applies to Lindsay. And, you know, they could have the most storming, screaming rows and then go on the stage and do a thoroughly professional job.
Despite the success of both the album and the tour, it left many wondering if the band would manage to hold together for one more album. They would, but those fans who were expecting a reprise of Rumours were in for a surprise. Tusk was to be Fleetwood Mac's most ambitious album to date, and one that would set the stage for battles that had been smoldering underneath the surface of the group's public unity. By this time, Lindsey Buckingham had enough confidence in his own success to make a few demands. The first was that the new album would sound nothing like the group's biggest success.
He didn't want to copy Rumours. The formula that gave him Rumours, he wanted to go somewhere completely different, and he did that. And that, in effect, caused problems within the band.
For the first time, Fleetwood Mac would be sidelined, as their resident guitar genius worked out the album from his bedroom, rather than in a studio where he might have to face Stevie, or one of her new boyfriends.
With Tusk, it showed Lindsay's genius. His production is sublime. It's amazing. It gives me chills. I think Tusk is in its music is so diverse, hugely experimental, and that's exactly what Lindsay wanted.
But the music on Tusk was different, and the public reacted to it.
I think Tusk is the album that endeared them to America and finished them off for the British, because it wasn't an album of nice, tight little songs. It wasn't something you could put on at the dinner party, your Abigail's party, if you will. It was a difficult album, and it was a self-indulgent album. It was Lindsay's record in a sense as the producer, but it's also Mick's record, because Mick has always wanted to be more of a musician than he's allowed to be, simply being the drummer in a rock and roll band.
The new album was not Rumours, and it didn't sell nearly as well. But was that a fair assessment of the album?
You can basically split Tusk into two albums. You have the Christine and the Stevie side of it, which followed on from Rumours, and you have Lindsay's, which is totally different. It's like I think he's been on record just to say they're in the production room and they just turned all the knobs 180 degrees and said we're going with that.
Well, it's this syndrome really, follow that. I think it's enormously hard. Okay, you know, brilliant in a way situation to be in, but I think that such a lot of themselves have gone into the previous one that it was a difficult album for them, and it got kind of mixed reviews. I mean, I was saying, you know, some critics called it a failure, and I said in my book, well, if selling 5 million copies of an album is a failure, then give me some failure, please.
In the midst of the tremors that Tusk was causing among the group's newfound diehard fan base, the band decided it was time to take the show out on the road in support of the album. The tour would take them all over the world and would last almost a year. Once again, like the time during Rumours, the close proximity to each other began to fray tempers. It culminated in an onstage incident on the Australian leg of the tour, where Lindsay, having had too much to drink, decided to take out his frustrations on his former paramour, Stevie Nicks. First, he played the parts to her biggest songs improperly. Then, he actually kicked her on stage. The rest of the band was not amused.
Lindsay really had a pop at Stevie on stage, and they all dashed off stage and they all sort of laid into Lindsay. I think Christine got to him first. I think that really is very much indicative of how the tensions had built to that point, where they just, you know, were about to fall apart.
The end of the tour was a welcome relief from the rigors of performing, but it was not without controversy. Mick Fleetwood had for a number of years functioned as the group's manager, which had seemed like a good idea, in that the manager would now have the best interests of the band at heart. But managing Fleetwood Mac was no easy task. Plus, to top it off, he had developed a clandestine relationship with another member of the band. Something had to give.
I think you had the now publicised Mick and Stevie relationship. You had the fact that the Tusk album was not shifting as many copies as certainly Warner Brothers would have liked. And at the end of it, that the Tusk tour didn't actually make them any money because they were living, their expenses were so high. And this all catapulted into more pressure. And I think certainly Lindsay suffered from that pressure.
When the band found out that they had little or no money for their year-long tour, they fired Mick as manager. It was anybody's guess what would become of Fleetwood Mac. But for one member, the future seemed bright.
Stevie obviously went on with her solo career. She became detached from the band and she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. Maybe if Rumours hadn't happened the way it did, she may not have been able to do that.
However, that put the other band members in a very difficult position because they didn't know whether or not she was going to rejoin the band. They thought that, you know, oh, there goes another member. But she remained loyal, and to this day she's remained loyal to that band.
Stevie's solo efforts were wildly successful, but at heart she was still a member of Fleetwood Mac, and she was there for the recording of their next album, though not as much as some would have liked.
Stevie just produced Belladonna and had gone out on a very, very small tour for it, but I'm pretty certain the forces around Stevie's solo career would have liked her to prolong that tour because she was selling out venues. Belladonna went to #1 on the album, on the Billboard chart, so she could fill the venues and bring the money in to her and obviously the management company, etc., etc.
The new album would not be like Tusk, a record which definitely allowed Lindsey Buckingham to stretch his creative wings. but more like Rumours in that it would be a collection of radio-friendly pop songs. It also capitalized on Stevie's new image as the mystical queen of rock with the single Gypsy. It made her an even bigger star.
There was an incident. You had these two fans. They caught her and said, "Can you sign my arm?" And they went away and had this Stevie tattooed on her arm where she'd signed it. But she went crazy over this. These are the lengths that people were going to.
But with Stevie's burgeoning solo career, there was new tension to be dealt with, especially for her former soulmate.
He is, of course, of all of them, the most prolific songwriter. So there's never enough room for him, in a sense. And I think he was frustrated because his solo stuff, good quality though it is, has never really, got near to the sort of Fleetwood Mac popularity. And I think there were those frustrations, and he and Stevie would fight about whose songs were going to get on and stuff like that. So I think there's a whole, and we're now talking, what, 20 years on or something? I mean, it's a long time to be together.
He wasn't happy doing Fleetwood Mac stuff. He wanted to be able to be in the studio with his own music and experiment and do things his way.
Lindsay's solo career was not nearly the resounding success that Stevie's was, and he was becoming more and more impatient with the constrictions placed upon him by the band that had launched his career. It was evident on their latest album.
He seemed to be on 50%. He didn't really seem as though he really wanted to do that album. I think it was done more brought under pressure. He had his solo career going on in parallel at the same time as well, and I think his mind was more on that, but he felt obliged that he had to do the Mirage album and also produce it and spend X amount of time in the studio overdubbing the album. But he did it, but his songs were not of the same scale that were on Tusk and certainly were on Rumours and the White Album.
The album sold well and kept the band in the public eye, but what no one knew was that it would be some time before the world saw Fleetwood Mac again. The 80s rolled along. Fans were still wondering what would become of their favorite band.
Well, come on, little mama, let's tear this damn place up.
Music was changing, with new wave and a punk sensibility left over from the late 70s. Rebellion had gone mainstream and was worlds away from the laid-back California sounds of Rumours.
You had Elvis Costello, and you had even Tom Petty was meant to be a punk, for goodness sake. But what those guys were doing was just saying, wait a minute, pop music has always been about 3-minute songs with tunes. Let's do some of that again.
In those first few years of the 80s, corporate radio did not yet exist. DJs were freer to hype new styles of music, and among them there was definitely a backlash against bands like Fleetwood Mac.
There was a sort of vague playlist at the time, but not really, but that playlist thing came in later and before. But while I was doing it, I was lucky enough to be able to go and see bands say, oh, I love this, I'm going to play it. Whether it was new, different, quirky, punky, not punky. For the first 6 months of doing it, our boss at Radio 1 said, look, I'm really not sure whether you're the right guy for the breakfast show. You know, the music you play is too eclectic, it's too late night. And I said, no, it's not. Things are changing. It's gone away from like soft disco and easy disco-y stuff.
There was also the aftermath of Mick's management fiasco to deal with.
When I made a film about them in the late 80s, the oddest thing of all was the number of managers you had to deal with. Because I had sort of naively expected that once I'd got the agreement of Fleetwood Mac's manager to an interview, that it would happen, but oh no. Every single one of them had an individual manager, and it was like dealing with 5 different boxers about trying to organise a team. It was the most extraordinary thing that they were bound together by the fact that they needed each other because they needed the name.
It would be 4 years before the band would regroup for a new album. 1987 found the members of Fleetwood Mac in different positions. Stevie Nicks had continued her ascent as one of the most successful solo artists of the 80s, while Lindsey Buckingham had struggled for success on the same front. John McVie relaxed. Mick Fleetwood drummed and spent money, and Christine enjoyed life. But it was time for a new Fleetwood Mac project, in part due to Mick's mismanagement of his own cash flow.
If it's true that artists do their best work when they really need to, rather than when it's just an indulgence, which I certainly believe is true of a lot of popular music, then Tango in the Night is a perfect example of that, because there was a record that they needed to make some money.
But as always, there were problems, especially with Stevie Nicks.
It wasn't, Stevie being, I am the new queen of rock and roll. It was very much related to her drug abuse. In '87, obviously, Fleetwood Mac got together for Tango, but she had to have a spell in Betty Ford's to cure her cocaine addiction.
Lindsay, on the other hand, found himself once again at the reins of the Big Mac. He handled it the way he always did.
Well, of course, John and Mick came from a background of set up the amps on the stage and just see what happens. And that was the absolute antithesis of the world that Lindsay came from, where you rather feel that if he'd been 20 years younger, he'd have written computer games. This was not a man, I don't think, who felt very comfortable going out on stage and posing with the axe. He wanted to create finely honed music in his own studio. When I visited him when they were making Tango in the Night, I saw his studio, which was absolutely next door to his bedroom.
But the band would have to deal with Stevie's internal crisis, which came to a head near the end of the sessions.
There was a story that when the first playback of Tango occurred and Stevie heard it, she left the room fuming because she didn't hear herself on any of the tracks. So Lindsay then had to go back and actually overdub her backing vocals on songs like Everywhere because she wasn't on there.
Now that in itself put quite a strain on the whole production process of Tango, because Stevie wasn't available to do the music for Tango. And yes, it did cause a lot of tension. Christine got very angry with her about the whole process, but it sort of came to light during that time that she'd also obviously spent this time in Betty Ford's and wasn't able to get to the studio because she was on this recovery process.
The album was a success, but this time, when confronted with the idea of a tour, one member had had enough.
Because it was such a huge emotional strain on Lindsay, I've still got to go to work with that woman, and then having to tour with her again. And Lindsay was the linchpin, really, for Fleetwood Mac.
And with his decision to leave the band, one of the world's favorite couples finally called it a day.
I think it's always been said that Stevie and Lindsay could never really break up while they were still in that band, and the fact that didn't actually happen until '87. They were still together in the band, and all the frustrations were still coming out at various times, even though they tried to keep a lid on it. Basically, it was a breakup of Lindsay and Stevie, and then Lindsay walked away from Fleetwood Mac.
Stevie would hang on for a bit longer, but the Fab Five were no more. The band would go through a number of permutations, which brought them little success. Eventually, Stevie herself would leave due to a conflict with Mick over a song that had been written years before, but left off of the Rumours album.
But also, Stevie was putting together a box set of her solo album, Time Space, and she wanted to have Silver Springs, which was a track which wasn't put onto the Rumours album because it was on the Rumours album on the vinyl it was just too long, so they decided to cut Silver Springs out. And Silver Springs was a very personal record for Stevie. She'd given the rights over to her mother on that track, and she wanted to put it on Time Space, and Mick said no. And she said, if you don't give me Silver Springs, I will leave the band, and he didn't give it to her.
Yeah, so she left the band.
But then something happened that no one could have predicted. Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton was giving then President George Bush a run at the polls that year, and the young presidential candidate had embraced Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop as his campaign song. All of a sudden, the band was in the spotlight yet again.
Well, I was watching one of the programs, one of the conferences that they were having, and I wasn't paying much attention, but my ears pricked up immediately at the end when I heard the song being played, and then, of course, the phone was ringing off the hook after that. So.
And even more so when Clinton won the presidency and requested that the Rumours-era lineup be his house band for the inaugural. All but one of the members of the legendary supergroup were happy to oblige, but he was soon convinced by a very persuasive voice from his past.
Lindsay didn't want to do it. The rest of the band did want to do it, and Stevie was happy to after the problem with Mick previously. She decided she would come back and do that, but I think she said to Lindsay not to cheat her out at this moment, and Lindsay just felt the pressure to conform and do the performance.
His reticence was visible at the press conference for the event, which Stevie could not attend.
I left at a time when I thought the creative atmosphere was sort of at a low ebb, and I kind of jumped off in order to sort of reclaim some of my own creativity and to reassemble some of my creative tools. And I'm really just now being able to realize that, so I don't see that as something that I personally would want to do at the moment. I mean, I've got a band that's a totally different kind of thing that has a lot more to do with some of the musical nuance that I've been looking for quite a while, and I just want to see that through. But, you know, stranger things have happened.
The performance, however, was a resounding success, and it opened the door for yet another reunion that would take place a few years later.
Lindsay reflected on his time away from the band. It was 20 years since Rumours, and it seemed a good idea to actually let's go out and celebrate this album again. And they were happy. Lindsay was working with Mick, John, and Christine on his solo album, and he'd already recorded a soundtrack with Stevie Nicks in '96. So it just seemed right at this time to get the band back together and do what became the dance.
The resultant album and tour were wildly successful, and once again, Fleetwood Mac was a viable entity. It would be a few years, but the band would continue. In 2003, Fleetwood Mac would once again be on the road, but without one member, who had decided not to subject herself to yet another tour.
We know Christine McVie finally called it a day and couldn't be persuaded, not being a road animal at all, really. But there they are, selling out everywhere.
Some things had not changed in all the years apart, however. Stevie and Lindsay were now able to share a stage, but that hadn't changed their approach to their work.
Well, volatile isn't the word. They used to fight like cat and dog, you know, and even on the last quite recent tour, the dance tour, she said, you know, we still, after all the years, fight over every note that we play, you know. The drive that they both had just came together and produced great stuff, you'd say. But there they are, back on the road together. It's amazing. I mean, I never thought that lineup would tour again.
It is a melodrama that has entranced the world, a story of those who reached for a brass ring and captured it, and those who were destroyed by the quest itself. The end of Fleetwood Mac's story has yet to be written, but the world can take solace in the fact that one of the great love stories of rock and roll is still ongoing and still can surprise its fans. Fans who still have a devotion to a band that started so long ago in a different world.